I was taking a sip of my kinda warm coffee when Karen comes stormin' across the sand in leopard print flip-flops and a neon whistle bouncin' against her sunburnt chest like she was some kind of beachfront security officer. Her arm shot out, finger tremblin' with righteous fury, as she yelled that I was in violation of 3 separate HOA codes, 2 noise ordinances, and an obscure dune preservation clause that apparently gave her divine authority over my folding chair. She shrieked that my hammock was an eyesore, my barbecue was against policy, and my music was 5 decibels too loud. I blinked at her, mildly amused, while she pointed to a laminated flyer titled Emergency HOA Violation Protocol with bullet points she had clearly printed and highlighted herself. I let her finish her entire performance, her voice drawing attention from families, joggers, and seagulls alike. Then, in a voice as casual as the ocean breeze, I said, "Karen, I own the entire beachfront." Her mouth dropped open, eyes twitching, her whistle finally silenced. That was the first time I saw her freeze. It wouldn't be the last. It had started 3 weeks earlier when I moved into the so-called Sandpiper Shores community, a private beach development with big dreams, little minds, and a homeowners association that operated like a cult with printed bylaws instead of robes. My place wasn't a condo like the rest of the pastel toy box homes crammed together on the strip. It was a modern, clean-lined architectural wonder perched like a seagull nest on a rocky edge, mostly hidden behind native dune grass and low fencing. That was part of the problem. Karen didn't like things she couldn't categorize. The fact that I'd renovated an old surf rescue station into my home made me, in her words, a zoning mistake. I hadn't even unpacked all my boxes when I found the first note on my door. Handwritten in red marker and underlined twice for emphasis. It said, "You are not in compliance with HOA guidelines." That was my introduction to Karen Witherspoon, HOA president, neighborhood hawk, and full-time menace. Karen was the kind of woman who wore visors unironically, carried clipboards to barbecues, and called noise complaints if a child laughed past 7 p.m. She had a chihuahua named Atlas who wore matchin' outfits and hated everyone with the full weight of his tiny soul. I tried to be polite at first. When she invited me to the monthly HOA meeting at the rec center, I actually went. I even brought cookies. But the meeting was less a discussion and more a stage for Karen to issue proclamations. No oversized beach towels, no inflatable furniture visible from the road, and absolutely no personalization of exterior property elements without board approval. A man tried to ask if he could install a ramp for his elderly mother, and she told him he needed to submit 3 forms and a landscaping review. I left halfway through, stunned into silence. I didn't fit here, and Karen knew it. By week 2, she had escalated. She knocked on my door to tell me that my mailbox didn't conform to aesthetic unity standard. I told her it was the same one used in the rest of the neighborhood, just painted charcoal instead of sand beige. She said that was exactly the problem. Then she said my compost bin was visible from the road, which violated Article 7, Section 3. I asked if she had a measuring tape to confirm. She said no, but her eyes were trained from years of administrative experience. I asked what kinda administration. She said she once managed a Curves gym. I nodded slowly, realizing she had declared war and was expecting me to cower like the others. What Karen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I hadn't just bought the house. I had bought the entire stretch of unincorporated beachfront land 5 years ago during a market lull and a legal loophole that made it absurdly easy. The HOA had been established on lots that technically leased shoreline access from the county, which had since sold that access unknowingly and under a lapsed easement to me. As far as legal boundaries were concerned, I owned everything from the tide mark up to the dune line, which meant about 70% of what these HOA zealots called their beachfront paradise was technically mine. I hadn't done anything with the land until now. But after finishing the renovation and moving in, I realized this would be more fun than I ever imagined. Karen didn't know how to handle resistance. When she handed me a printed infraction report for putting out beach chairs without prior approval, I handed her a notarized letter from the county property registrar affirming my land ownership. She tried to call a vote to revoke my community privileges. I informed her the land on which she held her meetings belonged to me and I would begin charging hourly rent. She turned red and claimed this was extortion. I smiled and said it was market adjustment. By now, the neighborhood grapevine had shifted from gossip to awe. People who once averted their eyes when Karen passed started nodding to me during morning walks. One man even whispered, "Thank you," as I passed. I was becoming a folk hero, the David to her clipboard-wielding Goliath. Then came the barbecue incident. I had invited a few friends from out of town. Nothing loud, nothing rowdy, just grilled shrimp, cold beer, and a Bluetooth speaker playing 90s surf rock at medium volume. Karen appeared exactly 34 minutes in, demanding we shut it down. She said the smoke violated the HOA's Clean Air Enjoyment Code. I said she was standing on private land and she should leave before I called security. She scoffed and said she was the security. That's when I motioned to a tall man near the grill wearing a polo shirt and mirrored sunglasses. He was off-duty police, a friend from high school. I introduced him. Karen stopped mid-tantrum and turned to look. He smiled and said she was trespassing. For the second time, she froze. The best part was I hadn't even used half of what I had planned. There were legal notices I could serve, land use policies I could challenge, and community rules I could rewrite through a quiet alliance with other owners tired of her tyranny. But I wanted to savor it the same way you don't down a fine whiskey in one gulp. I wanted to stretch this dance out. Karen had built her power on fear, routine, and the illusion of control. And now every part of that illusion was unraveling one absurd incident at a time. Her authority wasn't just crumbling. It was being mocked, dismantled, and used as kindling for my next bonfire on my own beach. And trust me, I had plans for that bonfire. Especially when Karen tried to get the town council involved, because if she thought she could escalate this beyond the neighborhood, she was about to learn how deep the roots of beachfront ownership could really go. The fallout from the barbecue incident rippled through Sandpiper shores like a rogue wave crashing over a fragile sandcastle. By the next morning, 3 different residents had knocked on my door, pretending to bring over cookies, potted plants, or leftover lemonade. But all of them had the same glimmer in their eyes, the unmistakable hope that someone had finally found a way to deflate the HOA dictatorship that had ruled them with pastel tyranny. One man named Dennis, who looked like he'd aged 10 years under Karen's rule, confessed he had once been fined for leaving a garden gnome out during non-holiday hours. Another neighbor whispered that Karen had reported his teenage daughter for using sidewalk chalk on her birthday. I listened, nodded, and offered everyone a seat. I didn't need to start a rebellion. Karen had already done that by overplaying her hand so many times the deck was nothing but frayed edges and coffee stains. Still, I wasn't here to spark chaos. I was here for peace, good air, and the pleasure of watching justice unfold one HOA guideline at a time. Karen, meanwhile, had gone into overdrive. After her barbecue fiasco, she began weaponizing every possible rule she could twist into relevance. She dropped off another warning about my outdoor lighting, claiming it didn't match the official HOA-approved hue of coastal glow amber. I pointed out that my fixtures were solar-powered and shielded, and she replied that they disrupted the uniform coastal aesthetic. I told her my lighting was invisible from the road. She then claimed my dune grasses were too tall. When I told her they were native species planted in accordance with local conservation guidelines, she tried to say they encouraged snake migration. I asked if she had evidence of a single snake incident. She said she had a dream once where snakes came out of ornamental grasses and chased her poodle down a boardwalk. That was her proof. I told her dreams were inadmissible in zoning disputes. She left without another word, but not before snapping a picture of my house from 4 different angles. The next escalation came with the infamous noise complaint letter. Karen accused me of playing music past the designated quiet hours. The twist was I hadn't even been home that night. I had driven up the coast for a 2-day fishing trip. When I told her this, she doubled down and said the noise had been reported by multiple residents. I asked which residents. She wouldn't say. I told her I had security footage showing no one was on the property, no music was playing, and the only sound was the wind. Her face turned the same color as her nail polish, which she always matched to HOA flyers. She sputtered something about how technology could be doctored, and I reminded her that tampering with surveillance evidence was a federal offense. That was the 3rd time she froze, and this time her lips moved silently, as though her programmen couldn't process the contradiction between her authority and my existence. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing a little surprise of my own. I had spent the past week gathering paperwork, maps, boundary surveys, and environmental compliance letters, all perfectly legal, impeccably sourced, and utterly irrefutable. Karen thrived on ambiguity and imagined rules. I was about to introduce her to cold, hard fact. It was time for the first public display. I submitted a formal notification to the HOA board that I would be hosting a community open house event on the beachside portion of my property. The event would include a small food truck, live acoustic music, and an educational tent explaining coastal conservation efforts. I knew the moment Karen saw the flyer, she'd have an aneurysm. True to form, she showed up 3 hours before the event, clipboard in hand, demanding to see permits, food safety licenses, and noise impact assessment. I handed her a folder. Inside were all the documents, each one stamped, signed, and color-coded for convenience. She flipped through them like they were written in Sanskrit, looking for a loophole. I watched her eyes dance between forms, trying to summon the authority to shut me down. But I had gone through every channel. The county, the health department, the environmental bureau, all had cleared it. One even thanked me for helping promote native dune restoration. Her lips thinned into a scowl so tight it looked like it could snap her whole face inward. And then she said something I would treasure forever. She said she'd be contacting her personal attorney. I asked if that was the same guy who sent cease and desist letters to neighborhood kids for selling lemonade. She didn't answer. The open house was a hit. Dozens of residents came down enjoying the breeze, the live guitar, and the grilled shrimp tacos from the food truck I'd brought in. People who hadn't spoken freely in years were Logan, mingling, and asking me questions about property rights. I didn't grandstand or gloat. I simply answered honestly. Yes, I own the beach access. No, I had no plans to wall it off. Yes, I intended to challenge the HOA's overreach where applicable. No, I didn't want to make enemies. I wanted neighbors. It was that simple. And yet, the simplicity of it enraged Karen more than anything because it robbed her of her favorite tools, fear and confusion. She could no longer weaponize rules against people who knew the rules better than she did. The following morning, Karen delivered her counterstrike. She called an emergency HOA meeting, announcing a proposal to create a new bylaw that would limit beachfront events to board-approved functions only. I attended the meeting, sat in the back, and waited. Her voice droned on about safety, decorum, and community integrity. But then someone raised a hand. It was Dennis, the same man she'd once fined for his gnome. He asked how such a bylaw could be enforced on land the HOA didn't own. Karen said the HOA's authority extended to all communal aesthetic. Another woman challenged her, asking if the bylaws could override property deeds. Karen's voice grew thinner, her throat drier. When she tried to pivot, someone else asked about the barbecue incident. Then another person brought up the noise complaint fabrication. The room was unraveling. I didn't have to say a word. The entire community had begun asking the right questions. After the meeting, Karen confronted me in the parking lot. She accused me of incitant rebellion. I told her I hadn't incited anything. People were just tired of being controlled. She said I had no idea what it took to keep a neighborhood orderly. I said I knew exactly what it took. Respect, clarity, and a little common sense. She said she wouldn't back down. I said neither would I. Then I walked away as she stood in silence, watching the community she once ruled begin to turn its gaze elsewhere. Something had shifted, and even she could feel it. Her grip was slipping. And I hadn't even shown her the legal fill-in I'd been preparing. The one that might just dissolve her entire HOA board before the summer was out. That was still coming. But I could wait because Karen's world wasn't crumbling from a single blow. It was eroding one grain of sand at a time. 2 days after the emergency HOA meeting that ended in more questions than answers, Karen's behavior became something between frantic and theatrical, like a stage actress caught in a real courtroom. She started patrolling the beach at sunrise, clipboard in one hand, a walkie-talkie in the other, and her ever-present whistle swinging violently like it was about to declare martial law. The residents began to notice, and whispers floated like sea foam through the community. Was she unraveling or just doubling down on the fantasy that she still held control? Either way, it was obvious something inside her was beginning to snap, and I knew I was close to the moment I had been waiting for. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the hollow scaffolding of power she'd built over years of unchecked dominance. I didn't have to be loud or brash. All I had to do was keep being reasonable while she spiraled into her own paperwork-infused downfall. That morning, I watched from my second-story deck as Karen accosted a teenager carrying a surfboard. He was clearly headed to the waves barefoot and peaceful, but she demanded to know if he was a resident, a guest, or a trespasser. She asked for an access permit, a visitor pass, and then absurdly a written statement confirming he was not involved in any commercial filming activities. The boy looked stunned, mumbled something about just wanting to surf, and Karen huffed, demanding he wait while she verified his story. I stepped outside and called down, telling her he was my nephew visiting for the weekend. She snapped her head toward me, eyes squinting as if she could somehow outlaw blood relations. Then, realizing she had no jurisdiction, she blew her whistle and stormed off. The boy turned to me wide-eyed and whispered that she was scarier than his gym teacher and his mom combined. I offered him a soda and told him he hadn't even seen her final form yet. Later that afternoon, the beach was quieter than usual. People still came, but they lingered on the edges like uncertain guests at a party that might be raided. The mood was cautious. Karen's reign had been so absolute for so long that people didn't know how to function without her looming over them. But cracks were growing. Dennis and his wife began setting up chairs in front of their house without checking the angle twice. A young couple flew a kite. A man jogged with headphones and ignoring Karen's pantomime gestures that he was in violation of some fictional auditory perimeter. I stood near the edge of my property with a coffee in hand and watched the slow return of sanity to the shore. It was beautiful. And then came the moment I had been quietly working toward. A certified envelope arrived addressed to me from the HOA board's legal liaison. Inside was a formal letter stating that penned in review, the board intended to fine me $500 for unauthorized use of beach space for commercial purposes. The letter referenced my open house, the food truck, and the live music. It cited bylaw codes that were written before half the board had even moved here. The letter was signed by Karen and co-signed by a man I had never met, who apparently acted as their legal affairs advisor. I laughed for a good 2 minutes. Then I poured another coffee, opened my laptop, and began assembling the response. Within 24 hours, every board member received a digital packet from me. It contained a full legal breakdown of the land ownership rights I held, including parcel maps, easement transfers, zoning certifications, and a clear explanation of the county's decision to privatize beach access several years ago. The best part was a highlighted section stating that HOA jurisdiction ends at the official boundary line, which stopped a full 37 foot short of the dune crest, meaning everything beyond that was mine. The open house had been conducted entirely on my property, and the food truck had been parked on temporary mats I had placed for environmental compliance. I ended the packet with a courtesy note off-airing to meet for a discussion about how we could collaborate going forward, if they wished. I even included a copy of a potential community access license I had drafted, a generous document that would allow residents continued access to the beach through a formal agreement, ensuring they wouldn't lose their privileges if the HOA decided to continue as skeleton. It was a professional, measured, and utterly unshakable response. I waited to see what they would do. I didn't have to wait long. The next day, one of the board members, a woman named Sharon, came by my place. She looked nervous but curious, the way someone looks when they're unsure if they're about to witness a miracle or a public relations disaster. She introduced herself and said she'd read the documents and wanted to talk. We sat out on the back deck. She told me in hushed tones that she hadn't realized the extent of Karen's personal vendettas. She admitted the board was often pressured into votes by Karen's relentless lobbying, guilt-tripping, and late-night emails. She said a few of them had been meaning to challenge her leadership, but none wanted to be the first target. I listened, then told her what I intended, a neighborhood where rules serve the people, not the other way around. Sharon smiled and said she'd talk to the others. As she left, I saw something new in her eyes. Not fear, not obedience, but resolve. Karen, however, was not ready to surrender. The next morning, she went on a print rampage. Dozens of flyers were placed in mailboxes, under doormats, and even stuck to a few trash bins. The flyers accused me of exploiting legal loopholes to undermine community harmony. They claimed I was planning to commercialize the beach, build a fence, install a helipad, and host spring break raves. There was a grainy zoomed-in photo of me talking to the food truck guy with a red circle drawn around us like we were planning a heist. The tone of the flyer was breathless and paranoid, the font oddly aggressive. My favorite part was the headline, "The Man Who Stole Our Shore." I was tempted to frame it, but instead I took a picture and emailed it to the county office with a note of skin whether HOA communications that make libelous claims could be considered misuse of power. I copied Karen on the email. That night, a group of neighbors stopped by again. This time, they weren't bearing cookies. They brought stories. One man said he'd been fined twice for forgetting to pull his trash bin in by 10 a.m. Another woman said her kid had once been forced to write a letter of apology to Karen for putting a rubber duck in the communal pool. Someone else had been fined for having the wrong kind of wind chime. We sat around my fire pit, the breeze soft, the ocean steady, and I listened. These weren't just residents anymore. There were people waking up from a long bureaucratic sleep. And the beauty was I didn't have to incite anything. Karen's desperation was doing all the work. Later, as the fire faded and people trickled back to their homes, I stood looking out over the water. Karen's house, 2 lots down, was completely dark. No porch light, no movement. The silence was loud. It was the first time I had seen it that way, and I knew what it meant. Karen wasn't done. She was planning something. The kind of scheme that doesn't involve clipboards or flyers. The kind of plan cooked up in silence where someone thinks they found the ultimate way to reclaim their lost empire. The quiet didn't last. It never does when someone like Karen decides she's not ready to fade into the background of her own losing story. 3 mornings after her blackout retreat, a new kind of energy pulsed through the Sandpiper Shores community. People were whispering again, but this time it wasn't about my legal packet or my fire pit gatherings. It was about a rumor that Karen had made a deal with someone from the county, something under the table and high stakes, something that could change the rules in ways no one understood yet. I didn't put much weight in gossip, but I trusted the mood of a neighborhood better than the words it whispered. And something had shifted again. People were watching each other with nervous eyes, stepping back into old habits, like they weren't sure if the freedom they had started to taste was about to be snatched away. When I stepped outside that morning, I saw a new sign near the main entrance, freshly planted and overly glossy. It read "Private Access Controlled by HOA Regulations." Below that in smaller letters was a warning about unauthorized gatherings and pending security protocols. It was both comical and ominous, the kind of sign that dares you to laugh and dares you to fight back. Karen wasn't just clinging to power. She was trying to rebuild it with bricks of bureaucracy. That same day, a formal notice was delivered to every house. This one wasn't a flyer, but an official-looking document printed on legal paper with stamped seals and the full board's header. It declared a special vote to amend the HOA charter and grant the board emergency authority to override individual property objections in cases of what they called community integrity threat. It was the kind of language that sounds harmless unless you've spent time around corporate lawyers and paranoid suburban monarchs. Community integrity threat was vague enough to mean anything and dangerous enough to become Karen's new favorite weapon. If the vote passed, she wouldn't have to argue or debate anymore. She just needed 2/3 majority and a few late-night signatures to shut down whatever she didn't like. My hammock, my fire pit, my guests, my gatherings, my voice, all of it. But Karen had miscalculated again. She thought fear still ruled the residents like it used to. She assumed their memories were short and their spirits were soft. What she didn't realize was that people who've tasted fresh air don't go back to breathing smog. And even though the vote was set for the following week, I could already see resistance brewing again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from within. That evening, I got a knock at my door from a woman named Lacey. She was soft-spoken, middle-aged, and impeccably organized in the way that made me think she'd probably run a few PTA campaigns in her time. She told me she'd read the fine print in the emergency charter amendment and noticed something odd. The language wasn't just vague. It was nearly identical to a failed bylaw from another neighborhood 3 towns over, one that had been sued and dissolved after homeowners challenged the legality of overriding individual deed protections. Lacey said she'd printed out the lawsuit details and handed me a folder thicker than Karen's rulebook. It was a gold mine, a legal precedent, a blueprint for pushback. I asked if she wanted to help me write a counter-petition. She smiled and said she already had. Over the next 3 days, everything accelerated. Karen organized a series of town hall-style meetings to promote her emergency vote, inviting residents to hear her explain the need for urgent action and preserving community order. She stood at the podium in the recreation hall like a preacher at a fire and brimstone revival, quoting bylaws like scripture and spinning stories about imagined threats. She talked about me without saying my name, referring instead to certain individuals who had circumvented traditional values and exploited technicalities. She talked about outsiders, noise pollution, visual disharmony, and something she called shoreline behavioral erosion. I didn't know what that meant, and neither did anyone else. But the applause was weaker this time. People clapped out of habit, not conviction. And when Lacey stood up and asked if the board had reviewed the legality of their proposed amendment, Karen deflected. When someone else asked about the lawsuit Lacey had referenced, Karen went silent, then dismissed the question. But the seed had been planted. Meanwhile, I kept my moves quiet. I wasn't gonna match Karen's theater with spectacle. I was gonna counter her desperation with precision. I submitted a formal letter to the board outlining the legal flaws in their proposed amendment, citing the lawsuit Lacey had found and adding several county-level statutes they hadn't accounted for. I sent a copy to the county zoning office just for good measure. Then I printed and distributed my own flyers, not warnings or propaganda, but clear, concise explanations of the risks the emergency vote posed to everyone's property rights. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The facts were enough. By the time the weekend rolled in, the community was no longer whispering. It was buzzing. And then on Sunday came the ultimate twist. A retired real estate attorney named Walt, who had lived at the far end of the development for over a decade and hadn't attended a single HOA meeting in years, stepped forward. He wrote an open letter to the board and distributed it through everyone's mailbox. It was professional, brutally clear, and legally devastating. He explained that the proposed amendment was not only unenforceable, but bordered on illegal. He referenced multiple cases, including one in the state Supreme Court, where HOAs had attempted similar power grabs and been dismantled. He warned the board that moving forward could open them to personal liability. He ended with a sentence that would become the quote of the week. Power is not a substitute for permission and paperwork is not a shield against accountability. Karen lost her mind. That evening, she held a last-minute board meeting and tried to push through an emergency clause, claiming the letter was defamatory and that Walt should be banned from future votes pending investigation. The board pushed back. Sharon refused to co-sign. Another member abstained. The meeting ended in chaos with Karen storming out and yelling that none of them understood what was at stake. What was really at stake, though, was her illusion of control. It was slipping faster than she could replace it. The next day, the vote didn't happen. It was postponed indefinitely while the board reviewed the legal concerns. And with that, the momentum shifted. Residents started speaking more freely again. People who had remained neutral began siding with reason. Lacey became a local hero. Walt was seen walking his dog and high-fived by 3 different neighbors. And Karen, she went quiet again. But this time it wasn't tactical. It was wounded. Her sign at the entrance disappeared. The whistle stopped hanging from her neck. She stopped marching the beach with her clipboard. For the first time since I moved in, she looked like someone who didn't know what to do next. And I could have left it there. I could have let her stew in her own loss and let the neighborhood settle into peace. But I knew better. People like Karen don't give up. They retreat, reload, and resurface, which is why I took the next step. The days that followed had a kinda eerie calm, the kinda that settles just before a final storm. The beach was alive with the sound of children playing, the occasional hum of a speaker carried by the wind, and neighbors walking with a newfound ease, as if the tension that once coiled around the community like barbed wire had finally snapped. Karen had retreated from public view almost entirely. Her once clockwork patrols replaced by silence, and her grip on the neighborhood reduced to faint echoes of a rulebook no one was scared of anymore. The clipboard hadn't been seen in over a week. The whistle, last spotted hanging from her patio hook, now dangled unused, swaying sadly in the breeze like a forgotten relic of a toppled regime. But I didn't trust silence, not from someone like her. I knew the kind of pride she carried, the kind that fed on routine, hierarchy, and the illusion of purpose. People like Karen didn't disappear quietly. They didn't move on. They watched, they waited, and when they thought no one was looking, they planned. So, I kept my ears open, and I kept preparing because I had a feeling the final act wasn't over. Not yet. Then came the certified letter. This one wasn't from the HOA or the county. It was from a private law firm in the next town over, embossed letterhead, overly formal language, and a tone soaked in manufactured righteousness. It accused me of operating an unlicensed commercial venue, of violating environmental statutes related to shoreline preservation, and of willful obstruction of community governance. There was no legal stand-in behind any of it, just a flurry of buzzwords designed to sound intimidating. But buried in the second page, I found what I was looking for. Representation on behalf of Karen Witherspoon, acting in individual and concerned citizen capacity. It was a personal strike, a desperate one, the kind of move made by someone who had run out of institutional backing and decided to go rogue. She was trying to make it look official, trying to bait me into a court dispute that would cost time, energy, and public focus. But she had made a mistake. She'd made it personal, and I had already been prepared. I scanned and filed the letter, then called a friend from my old firm. Before I ever became a landowner, I had spent years in real estate litigation, the kind that involved loopholes, zoning wars, and neighborly disputes turned municipal dramas. It was part of why I'd bought the land in the first place. I saw how fragile power really was in these situations. How easily it shifted when the facts were on your side. My friend Eric, now a partner at a regional firm, laughed when he read Karen's legal letter. He said it read like it was drafted by someone who learned law from reality TV and neighborhood Facebook groups. Still, he helped me draft the perfect response. Polite, professional, and devastating. It outlined her baseless claims, cited the ongoing conservation trust designation I had in process, and warned that any further harassment could constitute malicious prosecution or abusive process. I didn't threaten her. I just let her know she'd made herself vulnerable, and I made sure the letter was delivered not just to her, but to the entire HOA board, just in case she thought she was acting quietly. The response must have hit her hard because the next day she broke her silence. She came marching down the beach around noon, not dressed in her usual pastel leisure uniform, but in something far more formal, almost ceremonial. Her visor was gone, replaced with a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried a leather folder under her arm like she was about to make a final speech to Parliament. She didn't come straight to me. Instead, she planted herself right at the middle of the beach, raised the folder, and began addressing anyone within earshot. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words came fast, rehearsed, and loud enough to be heard across the dunes. She said she had been forced into action, that her silence was a result of deep reflection, and that the community had been hijacked by forces who didn't understand what it meant to protect something sacred. She referenced tradition, order, harmony, and even hinted at generational values as if she were defending a national monument instead of a set of poorly stapled HOA bylaws. I stood nearby, arms folded, listening as she painted herself as the last guardian of something precious. But this time, the audience was different. No one clapped, no one rallied, a few glanced at each other. A couple walked away mid-speech and then from behind me, Dennis spoke up. He asked her plainly if she was still planning to sue me. Karen turned pale, her eyes flitting from face to face, but she didn't answer. Then Lacey stepped forward and asked why she thought she alone could decide what harmony meant for everyone. Karen said she wasn't alone, that the board stood with her. Sharon, standing at the fringe of the gathering, simply shook her head. That was the moment it happened. That was when the entire community collectively understood that Karen was no longer in power, no longer even part of the structure she had once dominated. She was just a woman with a folder and a speech that no longer meant anything. She didn't finish her address. She closed the folder, straightened her shoulders, and walked back across the sand like a silent procession only she was part of. The wind had picked up by then, sending little flurries of grit dancing across the boardwalk as she disappeared behind her hedge line. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to because the final blow was already in motion. Later that week, my conservation trust status was officially approved. I received the stamped notice in the mail along with a certificate of designation and a fresh copy of the coastal management agreement. The beachfront was now legally protected, privately managed under my oversight, and permanently outside of HOA jurisdiction. I posted a digital version of the certificate to the neighborhood bulletin board with a short note that read, "Welcome to the People's Shore. No rules, just respect." That night, a small crowd gathered on the beach for an impromptu bonfire. No one needed an invitation. They just came. We grilled, we laughed, we watched the stars reflect on the water. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I felt what real community was supposed to be. Not rule-bound, not fear-driven, but genuine. Karen didn't show. Her house remained dark and silent, blinds drawn, no movement. Word spread that she'd resigned from the HOA board entirely. No press release, no farewell, just vanished from the structure she had once ruled with laminated threats and printouts. The clipboard, rumor had it, had been spotted in her garbage bin by the sanitation guy, snapped clean in half. Some called it poetic, others called it overdue. I just called it done. And so the beach remained what it was always meant to be, free, wild, and shared. The neighbors grew closer in ways none of us expected. Projects were started, kids played louder, chairs stayed out longer, and nobody cared if your towel matched your umbrella. And in the quiet moments, when the waves were all that could be heard, I sometimes thought about Karen, not with anger, not even with pity, but with a kind of strange clarity. She had built a kingdom out of paper walls, and when the tide came in, it washed it all away. Not because someone knocked it down, but because no one believed in it anymore, and there's no law that can fix that. The days that followed had a kinda eerie calm, the kinda that settles just before a final storm. The beach was alive with the sound of children playing, the occasional hum of a speaker carried by the wind, and neighbors walking with a newfound ease, as if the tension that once coiled around the community like barbed wire had finally snapped. Karen had retreated from public view almost entirely. Her once clockwork patrols replaced by silence, and her grip on the neighborhood reduced to faint echoes of a rulebook no one was scared of anymore. The clipboard hadn't been seen in over a week. The whistle, last spotted hanging from her patio hook, now dangled unused, swaying sadly in the breeze like a forgotten relic of a toppled regime. But I didn't trust silence, not from someone like her. I knew the kind of pride she carried, the kind that fed on routine, hierarchy, and the illusion of purpose. People like Karen didn't disappear quietly. They didn't move on. They watched, they waited, and when they thought no one was looking, they planned. So, I kept my ears open, and I kept preparing because I had a feeling the final act wasn't over. Not yet. Then came the certified letter. This one wasn't from the HOA or the county. It was from a private law firm in the next town over, embossed letterhead, overly formal language, and a tone soaked in manufactured righteousness. It accused me of operating an unlicensed commercial venue, of violating environmental statutes related to shoreline preservation, and of willful obstruction of community governance. There was no legal stand-in behind any of it, just a flurry of buzzwords designed to sound intimidating. But buried in the second page, I found what I was looking for. Representation on behalf of Karen Witherspoon, acting in individual and concerned citizen capacity. It was a personal strike, a desperate one, the kind of move made by someone who had run out of institutional backing and decided to go rogue. She was trying to make it look official, trying to bait me into a court dispute that would cost time, energy, and public focus. But she had made a mistake. She'd made it personal, and I had already been prepared. I scanned and filed the letter, then called a friend from my old firm. Before I ever became a landowner, I had spent years in real estate litigation, the kind that involved loopholes, zoning wars, and neighborly disputes turned municipal dramas. It was part of why I'd bought the land in the first place. I saw how fragile power really was in these situations. How easily it shifted when the facts were on your side. My friend Eric, now a partner at a regional firm, laughed when he read Karen's legal letter. He said it read like it was drafted by someone who learned law from reality TV and neighborhood Facebook groups. Still, he helped me draft the perfect response. Polite, professional, and devastating. It outlined her baseless claims, cited the ongoing conservation trust designation I had in process, and warned that any further harassment could constitute malicious prosecution or abusive process. I didn't threaten her. I just let her know she'd made herself vulnerable, and I made sure the letter was delivered not just to her, but to the entire HOA board, just in case she thought she was acting quietly. The response must have hit her hard because the next day she broke her silence. She came marching down the beach around noon, not dressed in her usual pastel leisure uniform, but in something far more formal, almost ceremonial. Her visor was gone, replaced with a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried a leather folder under her arm like she was about to make a final speech to Parliament. She didn't come straight to me. Instead, she planted herself right at the middle of the beach, raised the folder, and began addressing anyone within earshot. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words came fast, rehearsed, and loud enough to be heard across the dunes. She said she had been forced into action, that her silence was a result of deep reflection, and that the community had been hijacked by forces who didn't understand what it meant to protect something sacred. She referenced tradition, order, harmony, and even hinted at generational values as if she were defending a national monument instead of a set of poorly stapled HOA bylaws. I stood nearby, arms folded, listening as she painted herself as the last guardian of something precious. But this time, the audience was different. No one clapped, no one rallied, a few glanced at each other. A couple walked away mid-speech and then from behind me, Dennis spoke up. He asked her plainly if she was still planning to sue me. Karen turned pale, her eyes flitting from face to face, but she didn't answer. Then Lacey stepped forward and asked why she thought she alone could decide what harmony meant for everyone. Karen said she wasn't alone, that the board stood with her. Sharon, standing at the fringe of the gathering, simply shook her head. That was the moment it happened. That was when the entire community collectively understood that Karen was no longer in power, no longer even part of the structure she had once dominated. She was just a woman with a folder and a speech that no longer meant anything. She didn't finish her address. She closed the folder, straightened her shoulders, and walked back across the sand like a silent procession only she was part of. The wind had picked up by then, sending little flurries of grit dancing across the boardwalk as she disappeared behind her hedge line. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to because the final blow was already in motion. Later that week, my conservation trust status was officially approved. I received the stamped notice in the mail along with a certificate of designation and a fresh copy of the coastal management agreement. The beachfront was now legally protected, privately managed under my oversight, and permanently outside of HOA jurisdiction. I posted a digital version of the certificate to the neighborhood bulletin board with a short note that read, "Welcome to the People's Shore. No rules, just respect." That night, a small crowd gathered on the beach for an impromptu bonfire. No one needed an invitation. They just came. We grilled, we laughed, we watched the stars reflect on the water. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I felt what real community was supposed to be. Not rule-bound, not fear-driven, but genuine. Karen didn't show. Her house remained dark and silent, blinds drawn, no movement. Word spread that she'd resigned from the HOA board entirely. No press release, no farewell, just vanished from the structure she had once ruled with laminated threats and printouts. The clipboard, rumor had it, had been spotted in her garbage bin by the sanitation guy, snapped clean in half. Some called it poetic, others called it overdue. I just called it done. And so the beach remained what it was always meant to be, free, wild, and shared. The neighbors grew closer in ways none of us expected. Projects were started, kids played louder, chairs stayed out longer, and nobody cared if your towel matched your umbrella. And in the quiet moments, when the waves were all that could be heard, I sometimes thought about Karen, not with anger, not even with pity, but with a kind of strange clarity. She had built a kingdom out of paper walls, and when the tide came in, it washed it all away. Not because someone knocked it down, but because no one believed in it anymore, and there's no law that can fix that. The weeks that followed carried the strange sweetness of a place unburdened. It wasn't just the absence of Karen's presence that made the neighborhood lighter, though that certainly played a role. It was the way people moved differently, the way voices weren't hushed anymore, the way dogs barked freely without someone timming the decibel levels from behind a hedge. There was laughter in the streets, color returning to porches, and music drifting through open windows well past the once feared quiet hours. It felt like a slow unfreezing, like the neighborhood had been living under a thin sheet of frost for years, and had finally felt sunlight on its face again. The beach became more than sand and water. It became a gathering place, an open living room with no walls and no rules, just mutual respect. And even though Karen was gone from the meetings and the mailbox flyers and the foot patrols, her house remained a silent gray square watching from the shadows like an unfinished sentence no one wanted to address directly. But the absence of chaos does not always equal peace. Beneath the surface there were remnants. Old fears take longer to die than their enforcers. A few residents, still conditioned by years of appeasement, tiptoed around decisions as though Karen might suddenly appear with a citation. Some whispered whether she would return or if someone else might take her place. That paranoia, though faint, lingered in the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished. So I didn't stop. I kept hosting little events, nothing loud or formal, just open invitations to enjoy what had always belonged to them. Coffee mornings by the dunes, impromptu movie nights with a projector against my back wall, sunset yoga led by Sharon, who had apparently been a certified instructor long before she ever joined the HOA. It wasn't about rebellion anymore. It was about healing. And then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while clearing out driftwood from the north end of my property, I saw Karen. She was standing halfway down the slope behind her house, arms crossed, watching the sea like it owed her something. Her posture was stiff, her visor gone, replaced by a wide straw hat that made her look like she was trying to blend in with tourists. I didn't approach. I just kept working, letting the silence settle naturally between us. But she didn't move. She stood there for nearly 20 minutes, unmoving, until finally she turned and disappeared behind the hedges again. It would have been easy to chalk it up to a final check-in, a last look at the territory she once claimed as her own. But a few days later, I saw her again, not at the beach this time, but at the farmer's market just outside the development. She was dressed differently. Neutral colors, no clipboard, no plastic badge pinned to her chest. She was looking at honey jars, talking softly to a vendor. She didn't notice me, or if she did, she gave no sign. It was strange, like watching a character from a closed book walking around in the margins of a new story. A few neighbors noticed, too. There were murmurs. Was she planning a return? Was this a soft re-entry into public life? But no one had seen any new flyers, no rule sheets, no sudden demands for compliance. She hadn't reinstated herself on the board or challenged the new policies the board had since voted in, most of which removed or updated the absurd restrictions Karen had enforced for years. It was as though she had vanished as a tyrant and reappeared as a shadow, unsure where to fit. And honestly, I didn't know whether to keep my guard up or just let it be. Then came the letter, hand-delivered to my door in a plain white envelope. No return address, but the handwritten unmistakably hers. I opened it slowly, expecting one last barrage of threats or accusations. Maybe a demand for restitution or an apology. But it wasn't any of that. It was short, just 3 lines. You were right. I held too tight for too long. I don't know what to do with that now. No signature, no demands, just that. For a long time, I stood in my kitchen staring at the note, unsure what response it even deserved. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even triumphant. I felt something far more complicated, something close to understanding, though not quite forgiveness. Karen had built an identity around rules, around control, around the illusion that if she could regulate everything outside her, she could keep the chaos within her at bay. When that structure collapsed, what was left? A woman alone in a quiet house, watching the world move on without her. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. I didn't tell anyone about it. Some truths belong to silence, but not everything remained quiet. A few days later, a young family moved into one of the homes that had long been up for sale. A cheerful couple with twin toddlers and a golden retriever that barked like it had never known the word restriction. They were warm, open, unafraid, the kind of people who waved first and didn't ask about bylaws. That same week, the board, under Sharon's calm guidance, hosted its first open forum instead of a formal meeting. There were no lecterns, no voting blocks, no hidden agendas. People talked about their hopes for the neighborhood, shared ideas for community projects, even joked about adding a mural to the side of the rec center. I stood in the back and listened. And for once, there wasn't a single mention of violations or compliance reports. Just people talking like neighbors. Later that evening, as the sky turned orange and the breeze cooled the last heat of the day, I walked the beach alone. The tide was low, the sand wide, and the horizon stretched clean in every direction. I passed Karen's stretch of hedges, and for a moment, I saw movement behind them. A silhouette paused behind the curtains. She didn't come out. I didn't stop. I kept walking, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing left to fight. The war had ended not with a bang, but with a return to something simpler, not perfection, just peace. Back at my house, the fire pit glowed softly as a few familiar faces gathered around. Someone had brought marshmallows. Someone else had brought a guitar. Lacey was telling a story about the time Karen once cited a neighbor for leaving garden tools unattended for more than 24 hours. And everyone laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of laughter that says we made it through. We changed something. Not by force, but by outlasting the fear. By choosing to stay, to challenge, to believe that one person doesn't get to decide the temperature of an entire town. As the flames danced and the stars came out, I sat back in my chair, looked around at the people I used to call strangers, and realized I had never felt more at home. Not because I owned the land or because I won a legal battle, but because I had helped build something no HOA could regulate: community. And somewhere behind drawn curtains, Karen was learning what that felt like, too. Maybe she'd join us one day. Maybe not. Either way, the beach would be here, the fire would stay warm, and the people would keep showing up. No rules, just respect, and that was enough. Summer eventually began to wind down, not with a sudden shift in weather or some grand announcement, but with the quiet cues that only locals recognize. The way the morning breeze carried more salt than heat. How the laughter on the beach drifted closer to the fire pits than the shoreline, and how the evenings arrived just a little sooner, like the sun was starting to lean back and let the sky take over early. Life in Sandpiper Shores had settled into something that felt real, and I don't mean perfect or endlessly pleasant, but honest. Dogs barked freely. Kids dragged sandy feet across wooden porches, and the beach no longer felt like a monitored stage where everyone had to perform the role of the ideal resident. It felt like a neighborhood instead of a club, one with quirks and mismatched shares and a shared rhythm that didn't need to be voted on or enforced. Even the older residents, the ones who used to stay neutral out of habit, began to smile more openly, lingered during evening strolls, and bring out their folding chairs again. Not everything changed overnight, but the change was permanent. The spell Karen had cast, built from policy papers and laminated signs, had finally broken for good. And yet, she remained. She never did move. Her house stood exactly where it always had, a bit too trimmed, a bit too quiet, and more disconnected from the rest of the world. As each week passed, there were glimpses of her here and there, picking up mail, adjusting a planter, sometimes staring out toward the beach at strange hours, like she was watching a parade that refused to stop marching past her window. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She had removed herself from the board, from the meetings, from the circle of neighbors that had once revolved around her. But she didn't leave. That fact alone became a kinda riddle. Some speculated she was waiting, that she believed things would eventually go back to how they were. Others said she was too stubborn to leave what she had once ruled, as if her property lines gave her invisible stakes in everything that unfolded around them. I didn't wonder too much. I had seen enough of her to know the difference between absence and withdrawal. Karen wasn't gone. She was grieving something she had mistaken for identity. And grief, even if it's about control, takes its own path. One afternoon, near the start of fall, I was helping Dennis build a wooden walkway to keep the dunes protected near the north entrance when he mentioned something that caught me off guard. He said Karen had started coming out at night, not every night, but often enough that it wasn't random. She would walk the beach at dusk, not speaking to anyone, sometimes even barefoot, but never for long. Just a short walk down to the water and back again. Always alone, always silent. He said he saw her once stop and touch one of the new signs we'd put up. The ones that welcomed everyone to the shoreline and reminded folks about dune preservation and leaving no trash behind. She didn't tear it down. She didn't frown. She just touched it, then kept walking. I didn't say anything at the time, but later that night, I watched for her from a distance, not to monitor, but out of curiosity. And there she was, just as described, like a ghost testing the edges of a world that had moved on without her. The waves didn't care who she used to be. The sand held no grudges. She walked as though she wasn't sure if the ground still recognized her, and maybe in a strange way, it didn't. One evening, as the temperature dipped low enough to require sleeves, I set up the projector on the beach and played a classic surf film. Nothing formal, just something for the neighbors to enjoy under the stars. People brought blankets, popcorn, warm drinks. Kids huddled together in sleeping bags, their heads poking out like sea otters from a kelp nest. It felt effortless, like a tradition that had always existed, but had only now remembered itself. And then just as the opening credits rolled, I saw her at the edge of the dunes, standing behind a patch of tall grass like she hadn't decided whether she was invited. I made no move. I didn't wave or walk over. I just turned back to the movie. 10 minutes later, someone nudged me and pointed. She had taken a seat on the far edge of the gathering, not close, but not hidden. She hadn't brought a blanket, hadn't said a word. But there she was, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the screen. No one whispered, no one reacted, and slowly the air around her began to soften. For the next few weeks, she started appearing more often. Sometimes it was at the periphery of events, sometimes walking Atlas, her little dog, who had aged more gracefully than his owner. She never stayed long, never lingered after dark. But she was there. And over time, people began to nod toward her. Not with affection, not yet, but with acknowledgement. She even nodded back once when Dennis handed her a cup of cider without a skin if she wanted one. She took it, muttered something almost inaudible, and sat beside a small fire pit, warming her hands. It was the first time in months I had seen her not wrapped in posture or pretense. For a moment, she looked like just another neighbor, tired from the week, grateful for the glow. One afternoon, Sharon invited her to a board planning session for the upcoming winter events. Karen didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. She showed up an hour late, sat silently, and when the group asked if she had any ideas, she said she used to organize a beach cleanup every year and that maybe it was time someone brought that back. No one rolled their eyes. No one laughed. Sharon nodded and said that was a great idea. And just like that, she was included, not forgiven, not restored to any old pedestal, just included. Because redemption, if it ever shows up, doesn't arrive wearing robes and trumpets. It arrives quietly, covered in dust, unsure of where to sit. And when that happens, you don't fight it. You let it come close. You let it watch the movie. You let it bring cider to its lips and sit by the fire. Because communities don't heal through exile. They heal through humility. By the time winter touched the edges of the coast, Karen had become something different. Not beloved, but not feared. Not in charge, but not irrelevant. She helped organize the cleanup. She started speaking again at meetings, though only when asked. She removed the fake security sign from her front lawn. And one morning, as I walked past her house, she was standing outside planting something. I nodded. She nodded back. And that was all. That was enough. That night, a new fire danced in the pit by my house. The neighbors gathered again, bundled in layers, sipping cocoa and telling stories of the summer. Someone played guitar, off-key, but heartfelt. Children made shapes in the sand with gloved hands. And as I looked around, I saw not perfection, but something better. Balance. Karen stood off to one side holding a thermos, talking quietly with Sharon. The clipboard was gone for good. The whistle never came back, and the beach, still mine by law, no longer needed fences or reminders or signatures. It belonged to everyone now. Not because we had to agree, but because we finally understood that the best kind of order doesn't come from rules. It comes from remembering we're all just people trying to live in the same sky with the same waves at our feet. And on that shore, no matter what came before, we had learned to make room for each other again.